In today's video, we are going to do a rotor analysis where I break down a handful of different flights, different situations, walk you through what I see, and talk about what we can learn from it. With all of that being said, let's get right into it. Before we get started, I wanted to hop on here and let you know that we are launching our new product, the Uinta Adventure Pack. Visit uintapacks.com for more information. The first thing we need to do is define what rotor is. Rotor is the turbulent air on the downward side of an object. So airflow is flowing over something like a mountain, a building, a car, a truck, a trailer, and even you. As that air is disrupted by those objects, there is a turbulent, spinning, twirling air on the downwind side. Now that we've defined what rotor is in a very basic sense, there's a few terminologies you need to understand. The first one is what the windward side is. The windward side is the upwind side of an object, meaning if wind is flowing from the left side of the screen to the right side of the screen, the windward side would be the left side of the screen. The next term that is important to understand is what the leeward side, or what we call the lee side of an object. So in the same analogy, if the windward side was on the left side of the screen, the leeward side would be on the right side of the screen. Rotor is going to be found in the leeward side of an object, obstacle, mountain, terrain, and it's important you understand the difference between the two. Now that we've outlined some of the definitions, let's move forward and talk a little bit about wind. Wind is totally going to change the rotor you experience. The first thing I want you to understand is what turbulence is. In a very basic sense, turbulence is wind changing in direction and or speed. So rotor being spinning, twirling air, or as what they refer to as eddies, it is very, very turbulent. Here's the thing with rotor. In order for there to be rotor, there has to be wind. Meaning if you're flying around in 0 to 4 miles an hour of wind conditions, or what I would refer to as virtually nothing or no wind conditions, you're going to have no rotor, right? So if there is no wind blowing, there is no rotor to be created. And so you don't have to worry about rotor conditions. As you go from, let's say, 4 miles an hour to 8 miles an hour, that is what I would refer to as very mild rotor. That is something you still can handle, especially on the lower scale of that, closer to 4 miles an hour. If you're a more experienced paramotor pilot, able to handle yourself in the active piloting conditions, not something I would encourage newer pilots to be in, but is handleable. As you creep up closer to 8 miles an hour and you push 8+ miles an hour towards 10, 12, 14, that is where rotor becomes a very big deal. Now here's the thing with rotor, guys. It will absolutely take you right out of the sky at the snap of a finger. It is not forgiving. It does not give warning. It is immediate, and it can totally take you out of the sky, causing you to throw a reserve or worse, hit the ground. You have to respect it. You have to understand it. And the point of this video is hopes that you have a better understanding of where it is, how you approach it, and all of those things. So when it comes to wind, my personal preferred wind speed and what I teach students to stay under is 6 miles an hour. Under 6 miles an hour, and for the most part, you really don't need to worry about rotor. As you creep closer to 6, it's going to be very different than as you creep closer to 0 miles an hour. And so the general rule of thumb is that less wind is better. And if you're going to be going to fly terrain, mountains or hills or cliffs or ridges or buttes, whatever, it is important that you try to do so and you seek out the days in which you can do so in as little wind as possible. And so my personal recommendation is that you fly the conditions as light as possible, as less wind as possible, especially when you're new and you don't have the full grasp of where the rotor might be. Now that we've outlined that, let's roll into our first analysis of a recent flight I had. All right, guys, let's analyze this first situation hill approach right here. I want to just say right off the bat, it's likely that this is going to become more of a rambling video as I'm just going to start to spew information and things that I see and things that I was thinking as I was approaching on this hill right here. Now, when it comes to terrain, I think of it in two ways. I think of it as big terrain and little terrain. To me, big terrain is anything that's over 3,000 vertical, and little terrain is anything that's under 3,000. When it comes to little terrain, things are a lot less extreme. When you only have a mountain, a foothill, I should say, that's 2,000, 2,500 foot vertical, things are nowhere near as intense, as extreme, as exaggerated as it is when you've got something like a 5,000, 6,000 foot vertical mountain like those in the background. Meaning from valley floor to the top, there's 6,000 foot AGL gain, whereas these right here are more like 2,500. Whenever I'm approaching on terrain and I want to play it as safe as possible, my rule of thumb is that I'm going to climb to the height of the object like I have here, while I'm still rather far away from it, and even better, while I'm still at the base of it, meaning I am going to climb up to the height and then a couple hundred feet above while I'm still a mile or half a mile or further away from the mountain. And the reason is because as long as you're above the object, you don't need to worry about the rotor. The only reason you would have to is if for some reason you had an engine failure and you had to descend into the rotor, which that's a whole conversation we'll have in a minute. However, rotor is not going to be above the object. Rotor is always going to be below or on the lip, the top lip of the object itself. So in this case, that hill right there is where your rotor is going to be on the downwind side. Well, if I don't know which side is the upwind, which side is the downwind, I don't know which way the wind is blowing, the best thing you can do is just get above the terrain and all of the terrain and the proximity, right? Get above everything, approach onto the peak, decide, determine, figure out, identify what way your wind is blowing. Usually I do that by flying a very slow circle. Even better, I do that slow circle while I have my phone out and I'm looking at my ground speed, which can help me identify even a 1 mile an hour breeze. Once I have flown said slow circle, identified wind direction, I now know which side of the mountain is the windward side, which is the good side, the side that you want to fly, and the leeward side, which is the bad side, the side you do not want to fly. Now, while flying that slow circle, you also can identify how much wind there is. Is it 1 mile an hour, 2, 3, 4, 7, 15? Because that number and that wind speed determines, do you need to worry? Do you need to only fly the windward side? Or does it not really matter? Anything under 4 miles an hour, and I'm not really going to think about it. But even still, if you wanted to play it on the safe side, you know now which side the windward side is. So with this particular mountain, on this particular day, you can see I climbed up to above the hill. This is a habit, a rule that I almost always follow anytime I'm approaching terrain. Then I flew to said mountain. I flew around, identified my wind direction, and then I proceeded with my flight. Now, when it came to this particular situation, this particular environment, wind was coming from the left side of the screen or from the sun, but it was so little wind that I didn't even worry about it. It was under my 4 mile an hour wind speed of rotorless wind, you could say. So I proceeded by flying straight onto the leeward side and heading towards the next mountain range, which was the one that I was more so looking to fly. So once I approached the next mountain, the next hill, the next peak, I took the exact same approach I did on the first peak. I flew up to the top of the peak, above the peak, before I got to the peak. I flew my circle, identified wind direction, patiently, very patiently, slowly brought myself down to the terrain's height. I brought myself into proximity of the terrain, double, triple checked wind speed, wind direction, and then proceeded with flying mountains. It is so important that you are patient when you are approaching on terrain. In this particular day with so little wind, it didn't really matter, but I was kind of flying in a manner where I wanted to be able to analyze this flight later and show it on video, which is why I took such an extremely cautious approach. I also had a student with me, and anytime I have students in the air with me, I try to be an extremely good example, knowing that they're most likely going to follow suit of what I'm doing, meaning if I'm just flamboyantly flying in a sporadic, crazy manner, they're probably going to follow suit. But if I'm very calculated, disciplined, and doing exactly as I've taught them to do, chances are they too will follow suit. So it was important for me to take that extremely cautious, calculated approach to this mountain flying. So you can see, right, I came up to the peak, I flew my little circle, I identified that the wind direction was coming up this ridge right here. One thing I want to point out with rotor as well, that sometimes can get a little bit confusing, is that it's not just two-dimensional. And what I mean by that is that the rotor is not just off the peak. The rotor is also off the sides, off the edges, off the little hills as it's coming up the hill to the top of the hill, right? So all of those little foothills here in this photo I'm showing, those are also going to produce rotor. And if this peak that I'm currently at is lower, I could actually be in that rotor. And so you really want to be on the peak on the most upwind side you possibly can. And you really need to pay attention to things like those other little peaks that are lower, or this little ridge right here to the left with those trees. If the wind had shifted slightly from the left and was coming over that, well, I can't get in proximity of the ridge to the right because that's going to be right in that little rotor path of that ridge to the left. And vice versa. If the wind was coming from the right, there's no way I could drop into the little peak to the left here. I would have to stay on that ridge. So anytime I'm unsure, unconfident in my wind direction, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the highest spot I can. And with that, I'm going to go to the highest spot, the most upwind I possibly can. Then I'm going to stay on the tallest ridge I can, which was this one right here to the right. And I'm going to fly that ridge for a moment. All I'm doing is I'm flying around, is I'm sniffing the air, I'm smelling the air, I'm getting a layout of the land. What is the wind feeling like? And if you are patient and you very slowly approach into terrain, you'll very quickly notice if things start to get rough. And the good thing with very slowly approaching terrain is if you feel the tickle of turbulence, you always can just throttle out. The difference between very slowly approaching and very quickly descending in is that if you quickly descend in, you may already be all the way into the rotor shadow, and now getting out of it can be tricky. That's why I very slowly approach in. So with this ridge right here, I just slowly kind of came down onto it, flew it back and forth before proceeding with my flight. Now, did I need to in this environment? Not necessarily. We didn't have enough wind to really be concerned with it. But again, it's always a habit. It's a rule of thumb. Now, another really good thing for me to point out here with this particular photo is something called the venturi effect. If you're unsure with what the venturi effect is, it essentially means as you compress air or water, it picks up in speed. So if you think about when you were a kid and you were playing with the hose in your front yard or backyard, and you put your thumb over the hose and the water began spraying much further, much faster. The concept is that the same amount of water per second is flowing through the hose. The only difference is it has to be going faster because the hole that it's flowing through is smaller. So if you look at this ridge right here, you've kind of got this little mini venturi. Any wind that's going to be blowing into this spot right here is going to kind of have to squish together as it's coming up to the top. So although you may have 2 miles an hour of wind that day, if you find yourself in the best perfect little venturi, you may actually have 6-7 miles an hour. And one thing that's important to keep in mind with mountain flying is that what's happening right here is not happening over there, is not happening over there, and is not happening over there. So that is one of the reasons why I'm very patient. That is one of the reasons why I always like to confirm wind direction and speed as I'm approaching on terrain, is because, again, it's different in every location. The other thing with venturi, I always say, it doesn't take two to tango, meaning you don't need to have a second mountain upside down above the first mountain to compress wind and create a venturi. We refer to this as a compression zone. A mountain sticking up into the sky is causing all of the air from the valley floor to the top of the mountain to compress together in a venturi-like way all the way to the top. So what that means is the mountain itself is a venturi. If you've got 4 miles an hour at the base of the mountain, you very well could have 8, 10, 12 miles an hour at the peak of the mountain because all that wind has to compress together on its way to the top. That is, again, another reason I am meticulous. I am calculated. I think it through as I approach on terrain. Do you need to in light wind conditions? Not really, but it's a habit. And one of the things I've learned through teaching paramotoring for the last 13 years is that habits you build one day continue every day. Meaning, if I don't do this kind of habit every single day, if I'm not calculated every single day, why the heck would I be calculated when the wind is strong? A knee-jerk instinct is not going to be that way. So it's important, especially in aviation where things are not forgiving, that you follow protocols, that you are disciplined, that you do as you are supposed to do every single day, every single time to your best ability, because it's habits. It's something that's going to stick with you. You have to set the baseline of normal, your standard at a very high level, because human error is going to happen. You're going to make mistakes. The goal with setting these expectations high, these standards high, these protocols that you follow, is to reduce the risk of human error as much as possible and increase the safety as much as possible. It's not hard. It's not that long. It doesn't take that much extra effort to just be a little bit calculated and a little bit disciplined, but it greatly reduces your risk. With all of that being said, let's roll to the next one. Okay, so this next one is a little bit more, you could say, complex. We've got wind blowing from the left towards basically the center of the screen. You can see the arrows I have here. And if you look at it, you'll see there's a ridge right in front of me where it drops off, meaning I am approaching, you could say, the peak, and in front of me is going to be the rotor. Well, I proceeded to fly down to that peak and very slowly kind of drop into that leeward side, confirmed there was, in fact, rotor right there, as I expected. And I kind of sort of, like I said earlier, was flying this flight like this with the intention of making this video later. So backing up to the original photo, you can see, all right, we've got a rotor channel right here. One of the things that's kind of hard with rotor to really get an exact answer on is how long, how wide, how tall a rotor channel is. I'm going to show you a bit of a diagram of what I mean by rotor channel. And essentially what that means is there is a very definite, defined, exact location where the rotor starts and where the rotor stops. And it only goes so far. Commonly, it's not going to go all the way to the base of the mountain or the bottom of the mountain, and I'm going to show you more of what I mean in a second. And so figuring out where this rotor channel is can be kind of difficult. But you can kind of sniff out this rotor channel as you start to get more experienced and kind of bounce off of the edges of it on your way down to said valley floors. The other thing with rotor is that underneath the rotor is what we refer to as a wind shadow. So think of a wind shadow like this. When you're driving down the highway and you put your hand out the window, it wants to get blown back. But if you stick your hand right behind the rear view mirror, you feel virtually no wind. Well, in order to get behind the mirror, your hand actually has to go through the rotor on the way in and through the rotor on the way out. Well, the good thing with a wind shadow is usually you can just sneak underneath the rotor. Now, this is a little bit more of what I would refer to as walking the line. If you are walking the line, it means you are flirting with said rotor, and you need to be far more calculated in understanding where these edges are, these lines are, or what we refer to as the tipping point between no rotor and rotor. The tipping point is a concept between something when it goes from nothing to something. There is an exact moment, an exact line where that happens. So looking back on this photo, there is a little bit of wind, let's say for 5, maybe 6 miles an hour, enough wind that there is rotor that is noticeable. So looking back at this photo, there is going to be a rotor channel, a shadow, a depth of rotor. It's going to go for a certain amount of distance towards the center of the screen, a certain amount of difference away from me, and a certain depth downward. Well, I want to fly the valley floor in front of me. So a good rule of thumb, if I want to fly that valley floor, I don't want to get in the rotor. I don't want to just go through the rotor on my way down. What you could do is just fly to the other ridge on the other side of the valley, follow that down to the valley floor, and then proceed in the valley floor. That is going to be your safest approach to getting to that valley floor. As you reach that other ridge, you will notice if there's going to be turbulence on your way there, meaning you are now in the rotor of that original ridge and you need to climb to get out of it or continue even further to get out of it. Or you'll notice that it is not turbulent, it is smooth, and as you slowly descend down, maybe then you'll identify some rotor, you'll start to get rocked around a little bit, and you will proceed to climb back out of it. You can kind of feel that rotor channel out. Now, that approach and the approach of flying into this valley floor is not something I would do over 8-10 miles an hour of wind. That is just too much risk for my tolerance. There's going to be a high probability of rotor in that valley floor, but in the 5-6 miles an hour of wind that I do have, it's not really a concern. So the other approach that you could take is essentially bouncing off of this rotor channel all the way down until it's gone. So that would mean that I fly out towards the center of the valley a little bit, then I descend down slowly until I kind of feel the tickle of the rotor, and then I fly out towards the center of the valley a little bit, descend down a little until I feel the tickle of the rotor, and proceed until that rotor is gone and I'm at the valley floor. That is kind of sort of the approach I took. I flew towards the valley floor and then slowly flew a circle down, doing what I refer to as sniffing for said rotor. And what I realized was the rotor wasn't there. It didn't go that far. That rotor channel wasn't that long. It wasn't that deep. It wasn't really a thing for me to be concerned about in the valley floor. Now, if I flew to the bottom of this valley and I wanted to come back to the ridge that I am currently on, or that I started on, I would actually go to the further towards the sun ridge, climb up, get above the ridge that I started on, and then fly back to where I originally was. I would kind of do this calculated away from the rotor and then back over to the rotor kind of thing. So wind shadows can be a great way for you to fly in closer to the terrain without really having to worry about the rotor. You're not always able to get into the wind shadow without having to go through the rotor. Now that is a more extreme way of experiencing terrain and walking the lines, where you actually intentionally punch through the rotor into the wind shadow and fly the wind shadow. I've done this. This is something that is more so doable in canyons, especially deep canyons. So looping back to this particular situation, it is just a calculated, disciplined approach to mountain flying. I'm not rushing it, I'm not forcing it, but I am still able to fly all of the terrain as I would like to, where I would like to. I just very slowly approach on. I very disciplined and calculated approach the terrain, take a look at the terrain. I'm constantly analyzing the situation. I'm double checking my wind direction. I'm double checking my wind speed. I'm always just kind of feeling the rotor out. I'm always just kind of feeling the wind out. I'm touching the wind. I'm feeling the wind. I'm smelling the wind, right? I'm just aware, I'm alert. I'm not just blindly flying through this terrain. At least in this particular day where we did end up having a little bit more wind up here, on a day, again, where there's light to no wind, it's not as much of a concern. As well with that, if I wanted to fly all of this and take no risk of putting myself into rotor, all I would do is fly higher and just put myself 500 feet above the top of the terrain, and then I don't even have to worry at all about the rotor. There is one thing that you do want to think about though, as you are doing flights like this, and that is your engine out risk. Now, I'm not going to discuss the engine out risk in terms of your walking out, your landing situation and all of that. I'm only going to discuss it in terms of rotor. It is possible for you to find yourself in a situation where you have to descend into rotor because you had an engine out. That is a situation you want to try to reduce the risk of as much as possible. Meaning if I'm going to fly over this rotor channel and drop into the valley floor, I want to be high enough as I do so that I can glide to the valley floor away from the rotor instead of just descending straight through it. Let's roll into the next video. Okay, I briefly want to talk about this screenshot right here. I want you to pretend that wind is coming from my left. Although I am on the peak, you could say. What you want to be aware of is there any terrain taller than you, higher than you, upwind of you? So in this particular situation, there is another peak upwind of me that is taller. Depending on the wind speed, I could very well be in the rotor right here, despite being on the top of the tallest peak right next to me. So you have to think of upwind of you. And if you notice, there's little ridges over here in front of me and little ridges over here. The rotor doesn't just come off the top of an object, it comes off the sides and the bottom if you happen to have like a canyon with an arch in it or whatever. And there's rotor in all different directions. It's three-dimensional. It's not two-dimensional. It doesn't just go over the top. And you have to be aware of your upwind surrounding. It is extremely easy to neglect that upwind peak when you are thinking you're on the top, like I am right here. Now, I had different wind direction and this situation is a little different than that, but that's an extremely important thing to keep in mind. If you're flying to the top of the peak, is that peak the most upwind peak you have? Or is that peak just barely taller than one that's just a little upwind, because that just barely taller than one could very well produce its own rotor that you put yourself right into. The last thing I want to talk about briefly in today's video is the shape of the lip of the object. This is what we refer to as the separation point between the wind and the object. That is where your rotor is going to be. If you've got an object like this terrain right here, where you have a very sharp, very defined edge to the lip, your rotor is going to be very differently placed than if you have a rolling hill where the wind can very easily glide over the hill and down the other side. So anytime you're approaching on terrain, you also need to be a little aware of the shape of the lip, because the intensity is going to increase as the shape of that lip changes. You have something as sharp and rigid as this right here, that rotor is going to be right on the top of said object. And if you fly to the top of it, you still may find yourself in the rotor, because as that wind blows upward, now there's a separation point right there on the peak of said terrain, and you've got rotor right there. But if this just curved beautifully down to the other side, you may not have rotor until way down on the leeward side. Now, in a more extreme example, if this happened to lean forward and the wind was blowing up a forward leaning object, that rotor could actually be in front of the lip of the object ever so slightly, and you may think that you're on the windward side, which you are, but you're still putting yourself in harm's way because of the shape of the object. You could look at a couple of these example diagrams here of a object that's leaning slightly forward and how that rotor could be right in front of it, leaning straight up and how the rotor could be right there on the lip, or curved beautifully where that rotor may not even be until further down on the leeward side. So when I'm flying terrain, some of my favorite terrain to fly because of this concept right here is rolling hills. Rolling hills have less risk of rotor being right on the peak, in which case I can get closer, I can proximity fly, I can even top land peaks like this right here, where I don't have to worry as much about rotor being on the top. Whereas ridges like this one, or the one that's leaning forward or vertically, it's a little bit more tricky. You have to be more aware, and you have to stay a little further on the windward side to avoid that rotor risk. All right, guys, with all of that being said, I hope you learned something in this video. I didn't want to go into too much crazy detail, but this is something I could do at length. I could probably make an hour or 2 hour long video about rotor because it is that important. With all of that being said, if you guys are interested in our new Uinta Adventure Pack, which has a guaranteed best chest pack on the market, the best phone pocket, build quality is phenomenal. I could go on for hours about that as well. Visit our website, uintapacks.com. Thank you guys so much for watching. Click the like button, click the subscribe button, and I will see you all in the next video.